What do you think? What would be your advice on this one?
Look, I think Michael's probably raised a few points there. A couple of things is obviously depending on budget and depending on their entire cash flow position. But personally speaking, I think if we're looking at more the macro data, we always like to, as a company, try to get accelerated growth in a shorter period of time as possible. And I think there's no secret that Sydney and Melbourne, to that extent, have decoupled from the rest of the country over the last 5 years. But interestingly, when you look at the last 15 years worth of growth, Sydney sits at about 5th or 6th overall. Melbourne sits at 2nd overall with about a bit over 200% growth in the last 15 years. So really, if you want to look at it and saying, well, how long do you have to invest? What is your intention and how long do you have that property to work in the market? Right now, we see some really good population growth data, some jobs creation data coming out of parts of Brisbane. That's probably one of the strongest markets at this point in time if I'm looking at a more of a macro perspective. Now, from there, you've got to drill down to know your specifics in those markets, what property types are going to be most in demand. But if we're looking at here and now, taking everything into account being equal, obviously not knowing budgets and intentions, objectives, I would say that personally right now, Brisbane as a market, if I were to look at putting my first dollars into my first investment property, that is a market in general which I probably would say I prefer at this point in time.
Would you agree with Michael that the inner city is kind of the place to aim for, or is Brisbane more of a market where you could look at the suburbs or the next sort of ring?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, because if I look at right now, and our company does a lot of work on looking at the data specifically on where the jobs are coming and where the bigger infrastructure plays are, and if I look at Brisbane in particular, and we do look at every other market across the 8 capital cities, but in particular in Brisbane, we probably see 4 or 5 what I would deem to be local government areas, probably not within a 10-kilometre proximity to the CBD, that look to outperform, I would say, that inner ring over the next 5 years, especially in the attached dwelling market. So I think there's going to be a distinct decoupling from the attached versus the detached in that market, and I personally think that area is out towards the Moreton Bay Peninsula, out towards the southwest corridor, and where those big population growth and big infrastructure spend plans are. They're probably markets which I think in the freestanding housing space, getting good quality assets on big blocks of land or rezoned assets along quality infrastructure pipelines, that's where I'd be liking to see my money spent personally.